One of the ideas that have come from this radical revisionist movement in terms of colonialism is this idea of stolen land. Hence, you get your title not stolen. And I want to talk a little bit about land acknowledgments, which I think is the most ridiculous thing. Like, it's become so prevalent. I think even the DNC started off their convention this election year with a land acknowledgement. I even think I don't know if this is true, but I heard that even Taylor Swift is starting her concerts with land acknowledgments. Like the Canadian government, I know is really big on this thing. Um, it's so funny because one of the things you want to ask these people who say I just want to acknowledge that we're living on stolen land, blah blah blah. It's like, okay, well, why don't you move? Why don't you give your house up? Why don't you give your land back to a Native American? And I don't think they have an answer for that.
Yeah, well, it just kind of becomes a cheesy ritual again in place of real religion. It's literally a ritualistic kind of absolution for sins. There's a deep human desire for that, and that's what they're playing off of. That's why they've gained so much power. But logically, of course, it makes zero sense because all this land that we're acknowledging, the tribe that was on that land, guarantee you, did not own that land for more than 100 years. Because just like in Dark Ages Europe, in a pre literate society, especially one that is not a permanent farming society, but half hunter gathering and just hoe farming sometimes, those people have to move around. And so there's no permanent claim to the land that any of these tribes had. The Sioux were originally in West Virginia. They're not out in South Dakota. Just a couple hundred years, we can trace them moving. And so the idea that somehow when Europeans take the land, it's fundamentally different than when a native tribe takes the land from another native tribe. Well, you bet that native tribe whose land was taken away, they maybe had all their men killed and their women and children enslaved by the other tribe. They're not going to find that very fun either. So, first of all, that's a complete fabrication that the land belonged to anybody. And second of all, these were mostly hunter-gatherer tribes. There were some places with a little bit of hoe agriculture, which was semi-permanent. But in a hunter-gatherer society, there might have been a couple thousand people in an area the size of an entire U.S. state, because that's how you can get so few calories per acre from hunter-gathering. So when farming people came, i.e., the Europeans came and introduced modern farming, the calories per acre went up, more than 100-fold. And the population you can sustain went up more than 100-fold. And when we started connecting this land by railroad and canal to the economy of the greater world at large, then the land became valuable. Before that, it was worth literally pennies an acre. It was almost worthless. It could sustain almost no one. So the idea of land acknowledgement and say reparations based on modern values of land, that land, if you're going to give reparations back, for example, it should be about 2 cents an acre, for example. And so that's another issue we have to talk about. The land was basically worthless under hunter gathering. That's just how it is. It's been that way. Every acre in the world that switched from hunter gathering to farming has undergone a major transformation, and you just can't compare apples and oranges.
Yeah. I think it's also important to acknowledge that people are the product of their environment, the product of their times. This is the age of colonialism. There's a lot of conquering and reconquering of land. Everyone's sort of relocating and moving around. You don't necessarily see the settled borders and nations that we have today. And this is an interesting question that I ponder is, we look at the arc of history and the evolution of history. And what's his face? Francis Fukuyama or whatever. He's a
Yeah.
political scientist, but he says that liberal democracy is we've reached sort of the end goal of political evolution in a liberal democracy, and that's like the final um, goal. But I want to take that principle and apply it to land, because at this time in the Middle Ages, like I said, the age of colonialism, people are conquering land, reconquering land, moving around, borders are shifting. But now for the last, I mean, post World War II, really, we've kind of seen these defined borders. Do you see that as like the end of the evolution in terms of colonialism? Um, or is there still the possibility of lands being conquered? Because this principle of stolen land, of land being conquered, it's not stolen land, because to me that's the way that history played out. Those were the times.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a whole bunch of different processes. When you look at the history of the United States, there was about at least 400 years of it. And now it's what, 450, 500, depends on when you start. Because there were people even here before Columbus, sailing over halfway across the North Sea and stuff into Newfoundland. But anyway, um, the United States was 90% native until 1830. So for those first couple of hundred years, the Europeans were only on the East Coast. George Washington tried to create a line over which settlers could not cross, and it was right around the Appalachian Mountains. So, I mean, that's where after 200 or 300 years, that was the limit of where the Europeans had gotten in North America. And most of that land east of the Appalachians that was acquired by Europeans was actually purchased from the natives. So it was literally purchased in a land deal according to the law of the time. So in Massachusetts, they would go to the chief, they would say, "Hey, you have a lot of marginal hunting land that you don't need. We know you need ammunition and clothing. We'll, give you so many shillings for these couple acres of land." And the chief would be like, "Sure, now I can buy ammunition for my guns." And so those kind of deals were done for the first 200 or 300 years. Most of the time, the main time that land was stolen from the Indians was during war, usually when natives would start massacring settlers, and then because the settlers outnumbered the natives, they would eventually win the war and then take some of their land in recompense. That's not really stolen either. That's conquest by right of war. So between these things, most of the land in the U.S. for the first couple of hundred years, the 19th century is a little different, but for a very long time, the Europeans were trying to do things in a legal manner.
Hmm. That's so interesting. So the land was actually being legally bought from the natives.
Yes.
That's something that I was never told in school. I never learned
No.
about that.
No, there's whole books on it. There's academic books that I cite in Not Stolen. Greer's one of them, who've written whole books on the land markets in early colonial America. Jefferson himself writes a letter to future President Harrison and says, "Hey, our main modus operandi here is when they get in debt to us for clothing and guns and everything else they needed, we'll just buy some of their land because they don't need it. They used to own half of a state, but now that they're farming, they only need a village worth of land." And that's how the market worked.
Capitalism. I think that's
Yeah.
a very important point to acknowledge when looking at this history, because that's quite quite revealing.